What role do you think feminism has played in all this? Because I think from listening to conversations with you and listening to your podcast, I think you have a more positive view of feminism than I do. I think feminism is one of the greatest psyops in modern history, and I think it's been tragic on multiple levels. When I think of a lot of the stuff, even a lot of the things that women are complaining about these days, I'm like, well, all of this was directly or indirectly a long-term result of the same thing that people back then were advocating. But before I give my perspective, I'm curious to know what yours is.
Well, I think you might say that I'm more sympathetic to feminism because I understand sort of some of the goals of the early feminists and what some of their achievements, and I think that there's a lot of good there. But I think we're totally aligned on second wave feminism and like new age feminism today, which I think is a cancer.
Yeah.
So it depends on what the definition of feminism is. Because, I mean, you look at what the early feminists were trying to accomplish, and they weren't trying to accomplish, let's destroy the family unit, let's liberate ourselves sexually, let's destroy our babies. You know, they were actually mostly all pro-life, pro-marriage. They were trying to accomplish, let's ensure that, legally speaking, the worst excesses of men and the worst excesses of women, for that matter, there's laws that make sure that there is justice, basically. And I think that is a real... You know, and that's why they wanted to vote. That's why they wanted to ensure that they could own property, you know, get an education, things like that. Those things I think are inherently good things, but they can be used poorly, like any good right. Like any right can be used poorly. And women using those rights poorly doesn't mean that women shouldn't have those rights, just like men using those rights poorly doesn't mean men shouldn't have those rights. It means we need a society that fosters virtue and character so that we as men and women can use our God-given rights and our state-protected rights well. And I'm talking about rights not to kill a baby. Obviously, that's not a right. I'm talking about like the right to vote, to work, to own property, to marry, things like that.
When do you think it went too far?
I think it went too far once you get someone like a Margaret Sanger in the 20s. So it went bad. I mean, you had this really great movement, like the suffragette movement, early in the 20th century. You had some good stuff happening in the 19th century, but then you have like this kind of burgeoning, you know, sexual liberation stuff that started happening as well in the 20th century with people like Margaret Sanger, and then also a lot of eugenicists. A lot of this is like Nazi Germany, same time. You know, Margaret Sanger was actually pen pals with some of the eugenicists who were advising Hitler in Nazi Germany.
I didn't know that. Okay,
it's crazy. So the whole idea was captivating the the wealthy elites of, okay, we want to have a cleaner, you know, whiter race, basically. And Margaret Sanger was also looking at, you know, the conditions of the poor in, you know, New York, where she grew up. She grew up in this big family, and they had not a lot of money, and there was abuse. And so her solution was just get rid of kids, you know, have less kids. And then eugenics was captivating to her. And in that process, she also got involved in like sexual deviancy. And she was this crusader that founded Planned Parenthood, which is now the biggest abortion chain. And that mindset of, okay, let's deal with the problems we're facing today. It wasn't even about men versus women. It was about, let's deal with the kind of working man and the working woman's, you know, the poor's problems today by giving them contraception and by having them have less kids. And that's going to like lift them out of poverty. And contraception didn't lift anyone out of poverty. They were still just as poor once they got contraception or abortions. And instead, it started to... the ideology started to kind of evolve into this thing of, okay, as women, we should control our fertility using these drugs that are actually shutting down our fertility. And now we can be as sexually promiscuous as men because we don't...
As the worst men.
As the worst men, exactly. Because, a noble man is not sexually promiscuous. And so that, I think the kind of technological advancement, as they saw it, of contraception sort of empowered and put on steroids these terrible sexual ideologies that really captivated, you know, that was kind of like the flappers of the 1920s and 30s. And then you get the sexual revolution, the hardcore movement, the free love movement saying, we're going to practice deviancy. It doesn't matter. Monogamy is not important anymore. Fidelity is not important anymore. You get Alfred Kinsey, who's a sexologist who made up all these basically fake studies saying everyone's sexually deviant.
Oh, yeah.
Sexual deviancy is normal. Bestiality is normal. Having multiple partners when you're married is normal. We shouldn't like look down on these things. That's like repressive Christianity. So you see this like this sort of whole worldview blossom in the 20th century that is aided by the technology of things like contraception. And, as more and more, people are developing sort of these basically justifications for bad behavior, right? And then we get to today, where feminism is now, have sex as much as you want and sexual deviancy is fine. Abortion's great. And it's not even feminism anymore. It's become this like wokeism, the LGBTism of now
it's all eating
men
itself.
Can be women.
Yeah.
I mean, it's eating itself alive because there's no logic to it.
You're supposed to simultaneously believe that men and women are vastly different and there's a patriarchy and discrimination, gender wage gap, all these things. So men and women are totally different, but also they're exactly the same and should have the exact same interests, aspirations, to the point that there's complete equal outcomes in every dimension. Oh, but also there's social constructs.
Right.
And
it's not even real anyways.
and none of it is real anyway.
Yeah.
And any man who says he's a woman or vice versa is that thing. So you're supposed to simultaneously accept all these things in your brain. And I think this is a great source of mental illness.
I think you're exactly right.
Yeah.
And the other thing I didn't even mention about the 20th century was the rise of Marxism and the world wars and the violence. And I think you kind of have this perfect combustion of, justifications for sexual deviancy with modern thought, like I am my own God and I can do what I want and I can follow my own urges and I shouldn't have to have consequences for that, right? And then you have these, ideas that the family unit and God don't matter. Marriage is just a construct and doesn't matter. And it's a perfect storm.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting because we're dealing with a modern day version of a very old problem. I've been this year, I started end of last year, but I'm reading the Bible again from front to back, and
Awesome.
I'm currently sort of midway through the Old Testament. And I'm just like, these people are just doing the same.
They're like us.
They're just doing the same nonsense
Yeah.
over and over and over and over again. Just the spirit of rebellion. It's like, look, here are the rules. This is the way you should do things.
This is
like,
the law
no,
of God and nature.
They're like, nope.
Yeah.
We'll do it our way. We'll veer off this way. Boom, you get punished. It goes back. Have another king. That king also is like, oh no, I want to do it this way. And it just happens quite literally 100+ times through these stories. So we now have new technology and we're in a different economic position and so on. But I think it's kind of fascinating how the human condition doesn't really change that much. It seems like we just go through these cycles of, let's say, conservatism, and things are more hemmed in and there's more social codes and religious codes, familial codes and whatever. And then it sort of explodes. People are like, oh no, this is boring. This is the wrong way. Let's reinvent the wheel, thinking they're the first to ever do this. And then it goes off the hinges, and then something brings it back to sanity, and then some smart person again decides, oh, actually, no, this is too restrictive. Let's throw off all the shackles in the name of freedom, liberty, liberation, whatever it is. And it goes crazy again, and it just seems to go in these cycles.
I mean, a couple things. I think you're right. There does seem to be cycles of renewal and then depravity and renewal and depravity.
Depravity, that's the word.
In our own individual lives, as well as in like societies. I don't think we're doomed to the cycle. I don't think we're doomed to always the rise and the fall. I think that we are doomed to death. I mean, like we all will die, but there's always the opportunity to choose the good, even in the worst circumstances. And that's the hope, right, of any civilization, that you can choose the good. You're not doomed to be destroyed. You can choose the good. Destroyed, I mean, in a spiritual sense. But then the second thing that what you're saying makes me think about is the Garden of Eden, and what happened in the Garden of Eden. You had this beautiful, perfect picture of harmony between Adam and Eve, between the animals, between the created order. And then God is just like, don't try to be me, be you. Don't eat from this tree.
Don't do that one thing.
Satan gets into the garden. They were supposed to tend the garden.
Yeah.
And Satan gets in there. So already there was like complacency. And Satan gets in there, tempts Eve. Adam's just like hanging out while Eve's getting tempted, not doing his job as a leader because he was created to lead. And Eve is created to lead in her own feminine way, but she's also obviously disobeying, listening to these lies. She takes the apple, she eats it, hands it over to Adam, he eats it. They disobey God. They want to be like God, even though they are made in the image of God. They already are like God, but they didn't want to obey him. And then Adam starts blaming Eve. And, Eve, I'm sure, would blame him right back.
Yeah.
And like, you left me alone, you let the serpent in. I mean, who knows the conversations they had, right? Mm-hmm. But I bet they look a lot like conversations of disharmony today at the meta level between men and women and in personal relationships between men and women. So I think at the core, back to the feminism conversation, I think there's a temptation to wave the finger at one group of the sexes and say, it's your fault. Mm-hmm. Men, it's your fault. Or men to say, women, it's your fault. It's feminism's fault. Yes, I agree. Modern and new age feminism, it is a lot of that ideology's fault.